From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky arrives in Washington to try to secure more U.S. military aid for his country in its struggle against Russia. What's the holdup and what are the chances? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kim Strassel, joined today by two experts on this topic, my colleagues Kate Batchelder-Odell and Jillian Melchior. Welcome, ladies. So Zelensky stops in Washington today. This was after a swing through Latin America, where he was also trying to shore up some aid. This will be his third visit to the U.S. since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine a little bit less than 2 years ago. Let's listen to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talk about the stakes involved in this visit.
President Zelensky's message was direct. Ukraine will win the war against Russia if more aid is approved. But the contrary was also true. If no more aid is approved, Putin will win. It's that simple. Ukraine, the West, United States' strength as a credible ally are all hanging in the balance right now. Also, President Zelensky urged that we need to pass this aid quickly, because if we don't pass it quickly, it'll send a signal to the whole world that we are abandoning Ukraine and could start a snowball cascading to Ukraine's detriment and to our detriment.
Jillian, I agree with most of those sentiments, surprisingly, but it also strikes me this visit of Zelensky's has a very different feel from past ones. You know, you think back to that first visit when he was here, a standing ovation in front of Congress. This time, instead, we've got Congress mired in a debate over President Biden's $111 billion request for supplemental funding for Ukraine and Israel. Part of this has descended into a fight over domestic politics and the border. But it strikes me that the unfortunate reality, too, is that feeding this standoff is that the war between Ukraine and Russia has become a bit of a stalemate that has eroded some confidence in Washington that Ukraine can win and diluted the urgency of this situation in some ways. So, Jillian, why don't we start? Can you tell us a little bit about what is the state of play in this war over this 600-mile front? We know that Ukraine launched a counteroffensive this summer, but that seems to have slowed. Russia looks a little dug in. Where do things actually stand on the ground?
Yeah, so if you talk to Ukrainians, they don't like the term stalemate. I hear a lot about a locked battlefield. So what that means is you've got frozen positions at the front, but in the rear, a ton of stuff happening and an expectation that this won't remain stalemated or frozen forever, that someone's going to break through, and that those are events that actions now and support now will affect Russia or Ukraine will eventually end this stalemate or this locked battlefield. So a couple quick things on that I wanted to highlight. So the counteroffensive this summer, I think people had very high expectations going into it, because the prior summer, you'd seen Ukraine make these incredible gains around Kharkiv, around Kherson. That didn't happen. And part of the reason that didn't happen is the West delayed on providing aid. And this really gave Russia an opportunity to dig in to entrench these really nasty defensive lines, minefields that are difficult to break through. And so you've now got these trenches. What's happening, though, at the same time is Ukraine took advantage of this summer and some of its drone technology, including drone boats, to really push Russia back in the Black Sea. I think that's a really underrated victory because the Russian fleet can't really operate with impunity in the Black Sea in the same way that it was. Vladimir Putin walked away from the grain deal, had said that ships couldn't safely traverse that. And yet we've seen, just as of December 4th, since he walked out, 200 ships carrying about 7 million tons in cargo breaking through. So that's chalk one on the Ukrainian victory side. Now, going ahead, I think we're seeing a lot of strategic strikes in Crimea that are targeting Russian defensive positions, supply routes, communication lines, capabilities. And the idea there is that if they can't take back Crimea in the short term, you can potentially neutralize Russia's ability to launch attacks from there. And that's a really important strategic position. You're also seeing Ukraine starting to establish a bit of a bridgehead on the bank of Kherson further to the east. This is another spot that would give them a little bit more range to strike Russian support, command and control, logistics routes along that occupied territory. But at the same time, you've got Russia ramping up drone production, paying a lot of attention to how it's going to source ammunition, deepening its ties with everyone from Iran to North Korea, and then really sort of ramping up the same thing we saw last year with targeted attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure that are going to try to demoralize Ukrainians and make them feel like this is hard and unwinnable. You're also seeing along particularly the Eastern Front, Russia trying to seize back the initiative and launch its own offensives. So I think things are frozen. It's very tense, and it's a very perilous moment for Ukraine right now.
Kate, one of the things that just stuck out in that excellent analysis from Jillian was her point that this counteroffensive this time around was not as successful as it was last year, and that this was in part because the West delayed aid. And the conventional wisdom has been that Biden rallied the free world to Ukraine's defense while also carefully avoiding a wider war with Russia. But I think you can make the case that Biden has failed in a number of ways. Primarily, he failed to deter this invasion in the first place. And that was in part because of our disastrous abandonment of Afghanistan that likely emboldened Putin. But also, I think you can make the case that Ukraine's travails at this moment, as Jillian was alluding to, are because the president has hesitated at key times to provide the weapons in particular that might have made a bigger difference sooner. We had a great editorial on this today. And Kate, can you kind of run us through the chronology and the specifics of that Biden history when it comes to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're broadly right that the grid that the Biden administration was running everything through was, will Putin escalate? What will his response be? We were calculating all of our moves to our own risk of that perception. And in that process, I think what the Biden administration did was fail to appreciate the risk of the current situation that we have now, where the Russians exploited our nervousness to dig those layers of trenches, mines, concrete, and what would happen if the Ukrainians didn't win. So I think that was the cost of this strategy that was supposedly really just managing everything so carefully. And I would point to a couple specific cases where that it's hard to speak in counterfactuals, but you can look back and see where it might have made a real difference. I mean, tanks is an obvious one. We spent a bunch of time talking to the Germans, trying to get them to get Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And then we committed 31 Abrams tanks. First, we had to build the tanks because we didn't have any extra tanks. And then eventually the Pentagon got around to saying, well, we do have some excess tanks. We'll refurbish them. We'll train them. But I mean, this took 8 months from January to September, right during that prime summer counteroffensive, for those 31 tanks to get there. So the other really salient example, I think, is the Army Tactical Missile System. So these are the long-range missiles that plug right into these HIMARS trucks that you see driving around in Ukraine. And so those were something that we could have transferred a long time ago because they've had HIMARS since summer of 2022, or that's when we announced we'd give it to them. So these are something we could have provided a long time ago, and we didn't. And the fear was always, well, they might use it to strike targets inside of Russia, which was always very remote. So we held off on them. And then eventually, just recently, the Biden administration, some of these weapons turned up in Ukraine, but they're a variant where there's like a cluster warhead on it. So you might use them against an airfield, which Ukraine did to great effect. But they're not even the really precise missiles that you might use to strike the Crimean Bridge, for instance. I mean, if we had provided those much sooner and at a scale, I mean, a scale is something that I think has really been missed in this conversation. It's not just one particular type of weapon, but giving them enough to make a huge difference. I mean, they could have put those Russian supply lines in play in Crimea so much sooner. And so it's really regrettable to look at where we are now. And the only answer really is either we're going to cut our losses, which would be a terrible decision, or we're going to actually start doing what we should have done then. And I think there's still some opportunities on that. Offensive air power in F-16s would be one example where we're still trying to get them that. Maybe we could actually start to take that seriously.
Yes, you make a good point. You can't change the past. This is a counterfactual. You'd like to think that the administration has learned something from all of this. You'd also like to think that maybe Zelensky can play a role in that here. And, Jillian, let's talk about that for a minute. What is the case that Zelensky can make to Congress? You were talking about this frozen situation. Does he come in and in his talks with administration officials Does he promise a certain strategy? If you give us this, we can do this. Or is his goal here, and remember, we're talking about 61 billion as part of this package for Ukraine. A lot of it is earmarked for air defense munitions, artillery ammunition, anti-armor missiles, anti-tank weapons. Does he make the positive case for this is what we're going to do if we get this money, and this is the progress you're going to see? Or is this very much more the point that you heard out of Chuck Schumer earlier, that his case he's going to make here is if you don't give it, all is lost, and that this is a perilous moment and we just have to have it or things are going to go wrong?
I think he's going to make an argument that's a combination of both of those things. Ukrainians have a really powerful moral case in that they're not asking and have never asked for U.S. boots on the ground. They're saying, much like Zelensky did, I don't want to fight, I want ammo. They are willing to take on this fight. And, it's been quite compelling, I think. I follow a lot of the soldiers on social media, and I've been seeing what they've been seeing. And this kind of trench warfare is just so extraordinarily brutal. You're seeing guys who are down there with mud caked on their shoes, on their pants that won't dry off. There's been horrific problems this winter with rat and mice infestations, some video that would just make you cringe. In addition to the normal brutality and wear and tear of war, these are harsh conditions. And Ukrainians have stuck it out. And when you talk to them, what you hear is, we have to do this. We are the first line of defense, and Putin will not stop in Ukraine. If he is allowed to win in Ukraine, this will become a NATO issue. So I think that's a component of Zelensky's argument. But I also think he's making the case, do this now or you're really going to regret it. We could have another Afghanistan here. Ukraine is willing to fight, but it needs that equipment. It needs that Western support. And that's not something that Europe can supplement. It can provide aid that helps the Ukrainian government keep functioning. But we've seen such erosion of just basic defense military capability to manufacture and churn out everything from ammo to like the heavy duty equipment. The U.S. is really the only one that can provide Ukraine with what it needs at this point. And if it doesn't do this, I think we're going to be living in a world that's significantly more dangerous and a much higher risk of the U.S. getting involved in bloody conflicts. And keep in mind, too, that China is watching. If it senses a lack of resolve in Ukraine, especially with how much the Biden administration has put its political reputation on the line here, if it senses weakness, boy, we're living in a dangerous world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we all need to keep in mind that this is clearly Putin's calculation. He may not be winning this war, but he believes time is on his side. He just keeps it frozen like this and is hoping for a break of that Western will.